Sometimes on this show, we tend to cover games that don't exactly live up to the title trash classics, since they're just a little underrated. But today we're going all in and getting back to basics. Dirge of Cerberus Final Fantasy VII was not well received in any of the regions it was released in, and when you combine all the middling review scores, you get a pretty dismal Metacritic rating, which is a little odd since the game sold relatively well in its day, making it a perfect candidate for what we do here. And if this is your first time here on Trash Classics, we give a fair shake to games that just flat out don't get the love or attention they deserve. So without further interruption, let's jump right in. Dirge of Cerberus takes place 3 years after the events of Final Fantasy VII and centers around Vincent Valentine, a Hot Topic store that was somehow given sentience. In the relatively short amount of time after a giant meteor nearly wiped Midgar off the map, remains of a secret Shinra experiment have been laying low and waiting for the right time to enact their plot to awaken something called Omega, and thanks to something else called the Proto-Materia, Vincent is key in this. This unit of bioengineered super soldiers call themselves Deep Ground and seem to have been a pet project of the late Hojo. The rest of the story involves giving a bit more context to Vincent's origin story and fleshing out smaller characters from his past, as well as his complicated love affair with Lucretia.
Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Valentine.
As far as stories go, this is actually fairly compelling, and even though I'm not a huge fan of Square's obsession with over-explaining the events and world behind Final Fantasy VII, this feels authentic to the source material, which lends it a lot of credibility. Instead of going in deep with plot elements that were only mentioned offhand in 7, like Crisis Core loves to do, Dirge of Cerberus covers new ground and uses old info more like a base to build off of. I feel like this is the right approach if you're going to dive into an objectively perfect story like FF7's. And if you're wondering what the incorrect approach would be, well, just flip to any random spot in Advent Children. It was likely pretty stressful to add to such a beloved story, and I gotta give props to director Takayoshi Nakazato for making a genuinely interesting story that exists within the extended universe Square likes to call its compilation of Final Fantasy VII. I'm sure it's not easy taking a paintbrush to an already beautiful work of art, but DOC takes it in the right direction by mostly existing inside the established lore rather than adding to it.
And so I bathed in the blood of 1,000 soldiers. And I enjoyed it.
And while we're on the subject, seeing familiar faces like Hojo, Yuffie, Reeve, and even Cait Sith make a return is genuinely smile-inducing and manages to tread that very thin line between tasteful callback and derivative fan service. In that same vein, you'll be revisiting classic FF7 locations like Kalm, Nibelheim, and Midgar, only this time you're given a lot more real estate to explore, and that's exactly as enjoyable as it sounds, depending on your Final Fantasy fanboy levels. Now, if we were to stop here, most of you would probably wonder why the game got panned so hard, but it's the implementation of the gameplay that had people handing out 5 out of 10s like it was going out of style. Unlike any other game Square had made up to this point, DOC was a third-person shooter. Something you don't typically associate with JRPGs, but given the nature of Vincent's character, it actually kind of fits. Hitting the attack button will bring out Vincent's gun and one giant aiming reticle. Shooting in this mode is actually pretty satisfying, at least if you come into it with the right expectations. Getting an enemy inside your huge target area will, target them with a helpful amount of auto-aim, and damage is based on equal amounts of range, stats, and where you're hitting them. On top of that, there's items that can be used in a pinch, materia for special attacks, and an impressive amount of mobility options. Once you wrap your head around the way the auto-aim works and figure out how to move around comfortably, this game becomes a really fun experience. Combat feels great most of the time, and I can't help but appreciate the game's existence right in the middle of a divide between shooters and action RPGs. At the time of its release, reviewers were insanely harsh on DOC's gameplay, and that makes no sense to me. I mean, yes, I can admit it takes a little time to get familiar with all the inputs and mechanics, and yes, even when you do, the game can still handle pretty clunkily, but there's a really stylish shooter underneath all that. Side dashing around a corner and taking out a bunch of soldiers by hitting an explosive barrel is always a good time, and strafing your way through wide open firefights is an absolute blast. Of course, all that fun comes only after you've gotten used to the controls, which isn't exactly an easy task. I mean, not only is the PS2 controller, well, let's say less than optimal for third-person shooting, but Square wasn't exactly experts at this style of combat. So let's say, hypothetically, there were another option. Yep, after spending my whole life not knowing you could use a mouse on a PS2 with anything other than a stripped-down Linux distro, I found two games that are made infinitely better with one. Those of you who were there for RE Dead Aim's entry in my Resident Evil retrospective will remember how blown away I was that I could actually plug in my Logitech mouse and blow away bad guys with the best of them. Well, Dirge of Cerberus ups the ante further by allowing for keyboard support as well. Alright, listen guys, I don't know if it's coming through with my voice right now, but I am honestly floored. I mean, here I am playing an early 2000 console-based Squaresoft game with a keyboard and mouse. What kind of alternate reality nonsense is this? And on an unrelated note, I was actually really surprised that the PS2's USB ports had no issues powering my wife's mechanical keyboard and its RGB lighting. Guys, I'm starting to see that the PS2 was way more ahead of its time than any of us gave it credit for. Okay, so after that tangent, the real question is, how does the new control method feel? And the answer is not bad at all. In fact, this is definitely going to be my recommended way of playing the game. Both mouse and keyboard have remappable key bindings in the menu, and once I found a layout that spoke to me, I was running and gunning with much more accuracy and style than before. Of course, it takes a while to get used to the auto aim kicking in, but you'll learn to account for this while aiming, and it becomes second nature pretty soon. And on that note, I'm actually really glad the auto aim is still implemented when using a mouse, since look and camera controls were clearly made with analog sticks in mind. There's a boatload of acceleration when you get past a certain point while looking, which makes navigation easier but precise aiming a little more tricky. As a solution, there is a first-person mode, but this has the opposite problem. This mode allows you to aim much more precisely but makes navigation a pain, since mouse movement isn't mapped to a true 1-to-1 ratio. Of course, if this isn't your speed, you can always use any combination of a PS2 controller, keyboard, or mouse, so feel free to mix and match. All of that being said, this is still by far the best way to play Dirge of Cerberus. There were plenty of times while getting footage for this video that I had to just stop and appreciate how much fun I was having. Fun that, oddly enough, would have been hampered if we were playing the original Japanese version. In Japan, Dirge was a slower, clunkier affair that felt radically different when it made the move to the West. The version of the game that we got had all kinds of tweaks, from faster movement speeds and over-the-shoulder camera, and even a double jump, the latter of which makes absolutely no sense when you consider the fact that object boundaries weren't changed accordingly, leaving you with plenty of situations where you're hopping like an idiot trying to clear a waist-high guardrail despite being able to jump nearly 4 times higher than it. That being said, these changes did absolutely make for a better game, and while we're on the subject of really good decisions, you guys know I love me some weapon customization. Yeah, ever since my time with Parasite Eve, I've had a love affair with tuning my in-game guns to tweak specific properties, and throughout Dirge of Cerberus, Vincent can do just that by finding or purchasing a wide variety of chassis, barrels, and ammo types that can all make a big difference to how you play the game. And the good news is, after you've built your ideal gun, you'll get to do it 2 other times since you have 2 other quick change slots available, making sure you're good to go regardless of the situation. Now, at first I had a hard time looking at the lower left-hand portion of the screen, seeing which gun I was using, but I learned to notice the different aiming reticles, and this made for a much smoother experience.
Hey, Vincent! Long time! Captain! Oh, sorry about that.
And if we're talking smooth, we gotta talk about how drop-dead gorgeous this game looks. Using character designs by FF7 vet Tetsuya Nomura is always a nice thing, and since it followed the release of Advent Children by a year, it had a solid framework for some slick-looking CG cutscenes. The look of the in-game graphics is some kind of odd cross between realistic proportions and stylized flair, which actually works really well for me, and you might like too if you got into Kingdom Hearts any. Menus and other 2D assets are very well designed, and while the backgrounds are a bit simple and repetitive, they're also very high-res looking. Which brings us to my absolute favorite subject, upscaling. As you guys know, I use the XRGB Mini FrameMeister for up-resing my old game consoles to 1080p, and while this makes for some absolutely jaw-dropping retro video capture, it's also fairly criticized for not being the best at handling both 480i and its progressive scan counterpart. And after my experience playing so many PS2 games on this thing, I'm starting to think that this is just simply not the case. I mean, look at this crystal clear, razor-sharp picture. I absolutely love it. And if I'm thinking about it, this might be one of the best looking PS2 games I've ever seen before. The close-up shots makes characters' geometry look exceptionally smooth despite how complex it is, and even when zoomed out a little bit, the scaled image is still very impressive. And of course, visuals this nice are going to stress the resources a bit more, and this means that there'll be some noticeable slowdown when the screen is filled with enemies, magic attacks, and muzzle flashes, but it never got in the way, at least in my opinion. But there was one graphical quirk that was a lot harder not to notice, and that was the on-screen reticle. You see, turning on the generous auto-aim may make the game much more fun to play, but it also fills a good portion of the screen with this weird, over-designed nonsense. I played a good portion of the game with the auto-aim turned off, and this replaced the giant reticle with a smaller, much more manageable circle, but I'm just not 100% which one I prefer. It's kind of a toss-up of whether or not you want something huge on screen or you want to play really well. But regardless of which auto-aim option you use, you're guaranteed to have an absolutely great time with this game. I don't know whether or not reviewers knew about this game's mouse support or just didn't bother, but regardless, I think they judged Dirge way too harshly. This was a really fun third-person shooter / action RPG with all kinds of cool nods back to FF7 included for giant man-babies like myself to nerd out over. And overall world design just makes it feel so damn unique, it begs to be experienced. Yes, it can control more on the clunky side, but to be honest, this is an impressive first shot at the genre, especially for an RPG house like Square. Luckily, the game typically stays in the $10 range for a complete copy, thanks to all those middling reviews when it first came out, and if I wasn't clear enough already, I emphatically recommend you guys go out and snag yourself a copy. Its fun combat and forward-thinking support for USB devices makes it an absolute hidden gem, and a perfect fit as a Mako-infused, gunslinging, trashed classic. Hey guys, thanks for checking out the triumphant return of Trash Classics. If you like what you saw here, I have some other episodes linked on screen, and maybe click that subscribe button to stay current with the odd directions I take this channel in weekly. If you want to be a part of the crew that makes each and every one of these videos possible, wander on down to my Patreon page and join the ranks with my incredible supporters. Well, thanks guys, and I'll see you all later.